Where's my food, boys? I read something really interesting on Reddit today. And it seemed like a bit of a personal attack on me, honestly. Because the argument was that reading fiction is essentially useless. Where's my fork?
What do you mean, where's your
Unbelievable. This is all good content, guys. Try to pretend to have personalities. And the argument basically went that fiction offers nothing of value that nonfiction books or papers or articles can't give you. Basically, a lot of people argue that fiction is good to read and offers some value other than just entertainment because it gives you different points of views, it gives you different perspectives, it poses moral quandaries, philosophical questions, and then proposes answers to them that you can judge based on the content of the book you're reading. And basically the counter argument, let me take a bite, actually, I'm actually starving. The basic counter argument to that was that you can get all of that in a nonfiction book that gives you all those same moral quandaries, philosophical questions, different perspectives, points of views, while being real stories, and also giving you information, sometimes in an entertaining form. So that was the general gist of that Reddit post that really riled me up, and I want your guys' thoughts on it.
I'm a stage fright. So, what you're saying, right, is that nonfiction already provides what fiction provides, right? But more directly. Like you're saying, what's the point of reading fiction when you can get that same knowledge, whether it's moral quandaries or some philosophical ideas, or just straight knowledge, right, from nonfiction, right, when it's directly just poured into your mouth. But yeah, my argument would be like, one, like I read a lot of nonfiction. I like rarely read fiction, but I do enjoy it. Like I recently read Babel, and Babel, like you said, is one of the best. You think is one of the best books of all time. I don't read enough books to think, make that same claim, but I did think it was amazing. And I think one of the things that like you do get from from fiction rather, is that you get something super memorable and touching. I don't know any other words to use. Like stories are kind of ingrained to like the human psyche. People have been telling stories from the beginning of humanity almost, right? Whether it's around the campfire, it's one of the best ways to remember something and really like integrate it into our own personal lives. I could spew some kind of like, knowledge at you, like this is why you shouldn't do X, some kind of philosophical thing, right? Or maybe some moral thing. But if I showed you a story behind, like told you a story, like for example, The Boy Who Cries Wolf, a very simple story, completely fictional, hopefully. But, in that story gives a simple like lesson, right? Which you could tell directly, you shouldn't, but...
Don't lie too often because then people won't believe you when you're telling the truth.
Okay, right. Don't lie too often because people won't believe you when you're telling the truth. But it's not obvious right away. Like, if you tell that to someone, they might hear you, but they might not listen to you. When you read through the story of what happens to a boy, you kind of live through his story and see what happens to him. That's why I think fiction offers a little bit more, something a little bit different from nonfiction.
Obviously, I'm playing devil's advocate. Nobody come for me. Those are my bookshelves, not one of these bums.
You can't say that.
I just did, and it's going to go in the video. So I'm just playing devil's advocate, because why not? No, I don't think anyone else here is going to defend that Reddit post, so I will. You see the value of stories and the examples they offer, the illustrations they can offer for the moral questions, philosophical questions, lessons, whatever they're trying to teach you. But I think the basic response that immediately came to my mind was you can do that with nonfiction stories too. I'm sure for The Boy Who Cried Wolf, there's a real life story that you could actually use, whether it's from someone you know, from a historical account, whatever it might be. And the memorable moments you get, the connections you feel to characters, I feel like you get those from nonfiction stories too if they're written well. One of the best books I've ever read was a Thurgood Marshall book. Let me actually just get it. It was called Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and Dawn of a New America. And it was basically written like you would read a fiction novel, but it's all true. The author did a lot of research, got a Pulitzer Prize for this, and it reads almost like a fiction book. So it has the entertainment value, you get connected to the characters, it has lessons you can learn, poses moral quandaries, and then it also teaches you about a very important historical figure in American history. So it does everything you were just describing that fiction does, but it's also a real story that you gain knowledge about while reading this book.
I have a question. So you're saying it's like a book that's based on true events. Is it like fictionized? I don't know if that's the word. Like, when you watch a movie and it's based on a true story, but it's not exactly how it happened. Does the author in that case like kind of just takes the events, but like ties them together in an entertaining way, kind of takes some liberty to like make it entertaining?
This book I actually don't think did much of that. I think maybe some of the dialogue included is a little fictionalized, but I think even the quotes they use in dialogue come from actual phone calls that people are remembering, or emails, or not emails, there was no email back then, letters and other primary records from that time period. But there was also dialogue included like you would read in a fiction book that probably isn't 100% accurate. But again, it's all at least based on true events, so while it might not be verbatim quotes, it's pretty damn close. And every conversation that is included did actually happen.
So that's kind of different from what I think nonfiction is. Because like when I think of nonfiction, I think of like a book, something that I've been recently reading, a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, right? Where the aim of the book isn't to make it entertaining, it's to just provide knowledge in a cohesive way, in a way that's followable. But the primary goal isn't to provide content for the sake of entertainment. You know, I think books that fall into that category might be self-help books, things like The Power of Now, textbooks even, right? That's kind of an extreme version. So I feel like the book you're giving is kind of in like a blurred line.
I don't think anyone would classify this as fiction. They might have taken some liberties, but I think I would count a book like this as nonfiction, and I think most people do. At the end of the day, fiction and nonfiction are just marketing terms. So I do think this falls squarely within nonfiction, and no one would really consider it fiction. And again, I think if we want to focus on the distinction, when we're talking about fiction, we're talking about books like Babel, which actually Babel even is historical fiction, but let's say something like Mistborn, something like, I don't know, Malazan Book of the Fallen, whatever. That's all fantasy back there, but even something like Never Let Me Go, which you've read and enjoyed, that's what I would consider fiction.
For me, when it comes to fiction, the entertainment value is very important, right? I'm engaged by that fact that it's going to be entertaining. It's a great story, and the fact that I can kind of come home from a long day, the real world stresses, sit down and just kind of escape into a different universe without much thinking about like it's being too real. You know what I mean? With a fiction book, nonfiction book. With a nonfiction book, there's this ability to push the limits of what's possible in reality, right? And kind of build a story that's not possible in the actual world to deliver messages that's not doable in a nonfiction way, because those stories wouldn't happen. So for example, this is not a book, but the anime Naruto, it's impacted my life very heavily, and it's about this character who has this crazy monster within him, right? But I don't know if it's hard. Like, he has no race, ethnicity, or anything, you know? He's just a character who has a monster, and there's a storyline behind that. So I feel like it's so much easier to relate to these fictional characters, which allows the author to deliver his core messages and philosophical ideas in a much easier way without them being friction. Because if I'm reading a nonfiction book about something that's very real, you might have a hard time going to certain topics because you have other, prejudice that you might not be aware about, whatever. I would say that's a big factor for me.
I get what you mean. Is like when you read a fiction book, it can give you a different perspective of like how to view something. And like a lot of times you can actually see like fiction books will take events from actual like history. That's pretty interesting. Like a lot of times like you'll notice like in One Piece, there's like a lot of arcs are basically just real life places, real life events. They talk about really like hard hitting things that happen in history, like slavery, colonialism, a lot of things like those. And it could be a good way. Like if maybe you don't know about a lot of this history, but you might be interested in looking at it. You might notice it and be like, oh, where is this from? Because a lot of these things will seem familiar. And most of fiction is inspired by these things. I think there's value into that because it does give like a good way of interpreting these topics.
I think that's a pretty valid point, especially Rachel Ray's, Prosen raised, that a fictional character can be more relatable than any nonfiction character ever will be. Authors can take a lot more liberty with a fictional character and crafting their character and discussing their internal monologues and, portraying how they make decisions and all that. You can't really do a lot of that in a detailed way with a nonfiction character because you have to be true to the character. You can't take MLK, write a book about him, and then, give pages of his internal monologue that he might have had in a crucial moment in his life because we don't know what that was, and no one does. So you can take a lot more liberty with a fictional character, and that's a unique thing you can get in fiction. But again, to play devil's advocate, because again, I don't believe any of this, but I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here. The counter argument would be that books are a big time commitment. Like this book took me, I don't know, realistically 10 to 15 hours to read, right? In that amount of time, I could have watched a movie that had the same information, similar entertainment value, and was done in an hour and a half. And this is again a nonfiction book, but let's pretend it was fiction. That's 10 to 15 hours of time I've spent on a fictional book that I could have gotten the same value. And the value I got from that 10 to 15 hour commitment to a fiction book, I could have gotten the exact same thing from an hour and a half movie. So the counter argument I would present then is, sure, there are some benefits to fiction generally, but to the extent you're going to commit to a book and the time it takes to read a book, your time is better spent just watching a movie for entertainment and then reading a nonfiction book because it has objectively more to offer in terms of value.
I think that's a good point, but when you're watching a movie, you're really just an observer and you're just sitting there and watching the world unfold and the story unfold, and that's entertaining, right? But when it comes to a book, I think it's a little different. You're reading a script that tries to build a world for you, but in the world that you're building inside your head, it's more of an active entertainment type of thing. Like you have to participate in a little bit because you have to use your imagination to see this world, and sometimes that world could be different to another reader, right? So I think it's more engaging in that sense. Second, I think the argument about time being used in a very productive way, I think entertainment is valuable, and reading, that should be up to the person, right? Reading a book, that should be, I don't think that's debatable. It's such a personal thing. Can't really argue what's better or not.
All right, I'm gonna switch sides here because Because I'm actually a person that reads fiction rarely. I'll read it from time to time, but I actually read most of the time nonfiction. I do read a lot, but most of the time it's either textbooks, or some kind of book about some idea. Like for example, a book like Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a book about why humans are different in different areas. Like why is it that Europe got ahead rather than people in Australia, the Aborigines.
Aborigines.
The Aborigines.
Aborigines.
The
Aborigines.
the natives in Australia. It's a nonfiction book that I'm reading. It gives me knowledge, but I find it extremely entertaining. And I think that's something there. Like I do read nonfiction sometimes, but it's usually a conscious choice. Like I'll be like, okay, now I'm gonna read this book, Babel, consciously, but it's a bit more effort. Like if I'm going to choose a book off a bookshelf that I find entertaining, I want to read genuinely, it'll usually be a nonfiction book. And to add on to Rita's point actually about why movies is not active, you're not an active participant, right? That's true, you're sometimes an observer, but like I think movies do make you think as well, right? You're thinking about what is the movie trying to say, unless it's a very simple movie like Dora the Explorer or something, right? Like, then you're just trying to figure out what Swiper's doing. But some movies really ask you to participate and try to think about what's going on. So I don't think that's a good reason for saying, oh yeah, books are a bit more utility. All right, go for it.
I'm not saying books also make you think. Movies make you think.
Right.
But the world creation, the characters, his name is John, he has blue hair. Well, what does that even look? When it's on the screen, you know exactly what it looks. When you're reading the book, you have to imagine that character. And I think you're going to fill in some gaps. And you are building the world. You are becoming the character. You get lost in it. You become John. Whereas in a movie, I think that's possible, but it's harder to do because you are seeing the disconnect between John on screen and you, right?
100% agree with you. Like in a book, you know what the thoughts of the characters are. In a movie, rarely. Sometimes, like Mr. Robot, his thoughts are out loud. But most movies, they don't narrate the thoughts. Another fun thing about like reading books that eventually be turned into movies, like how you imagine like what Harry or Hermione look like, and then you see the movie later on. It's kind of like cool to see what the differences are.
When you read a book, you have the liberties to imagine what the setting would be like. But I also think there's a lot of things when like a story is written. Like if you watch a movie, like it's written at some point. Someone has a vision, and they need to put all their thoughts in a way that you understand what they want to show, right? But a movie might miss some of those details. Like they could have them in the thing, but you may actually miss it, right? And a book actually provides a lot more detail. I don't read like many books, honestly, but I remember reading Game of Thrones before I watched the show. Like the first book. The show was already done. I already heard like all about it. But the first book was like I didn't know much about a show, so it was all like from my like own fact, like how I thought what the show would be like, how would the characters look like. I thought it would be this grand magical thing into, right? And then it was like very, very like content rich. I remember like George R. R. Martin goes like into detail about the cultures, about like the world, a lot of it. Then I remember watching the show. The show was good, right? But it missed a lot of those details. Like a lot of deals were missed out. Like maybe it was like 50 or so pages would be an episode or something like that, 75. And show by really quick. The first book is only the first season. I thought it would be way more. The first book would be like at least 2 seasons. I just remember watching that first season and be like, wow, that was fast. And I feel like I missed so much detail. I don't think you can miss a lot of detail just from like maybe just watching the movie. So I think books offer like a much more closer vision of what the author might intend or the story was meant to be.
I think the conversation's devolved a little bit into the merits of fictional books versus fictional TV shows and movies. And my only point comparing the two was to say that you can get the entertainment you need from movies and TV shows. But then when it comes to reading, which requires 10 to 15 hours minimum probably for a book, maybe 5 hours for a novel or maybe 5 hours for a shorter novel, your time is better spent reading nonfiction. Again, this is assuming that it matters to you how productive you're being with your time and whatnot. Obviously, everyone is free to do whatever they want. This is more just a philosophical question about how you should spend your time, I guess. And if you're going to choose to read, what you should read. So I think all these points are valid about the entertainment value books offer that is unique and different from movies and TV shows. But I think the overall point is that if you are reading, assuming you're reading, does it ever make sense to read fiction? So I just want to bring the conversation back to that.
Yeah, I think I agree with Zaid because I tried to like just imagine myself, like imagine you had a long day and like it's like 7 or 8 o'clock and you have a few hours left and you're going to read something, right? It feels like really difficult to start reading a fantasy book for those few 2 hours that you have to yourself because it feels a little useless. It feels like a waste of time because you're going to be reading something. It should be something that's really useful and direct. Now, one of the benefits that you could get from reading a fantasy book would be like life lessons or something like that, something you learned. But sure, you might get a life lesson out of a fantasy book, but it's also like plagued with a whole bunch of bullshit of this fantasy world, right? That the author's trying to build. So why not just like get all the things that you can get that are positive from a fantasy book, like life lessons and like good themes, you can get that from a nonfiction book, right?
Are you still for or against? You switch sides.
So the only reason I switched sides is because like that's like what I am. I kind of like was kind of being fake when I was like when I was going for like fiction, right? Because that's what it seems like. Like deep down, I know reading fiction is useful, but like when I practically in my life, I read mostly nonfiction. And reading fiction, I don't know, like deep down, there's a reason I do that, right? Like I have to agree, like in sometimes when I like try to read fiction, I do feel like it's a waste of time. I stopped like maybe 3/4 of the way, halfway through Babel, because there was just
blasphemy.
there was just some.
That's blasphemy.
There was just other stuff I wanted to read, like the desire. I wouldn't want to say it was boring. There were just more entertaining things, at least for me. Like and also utility, things that were more useful to me.
You don't deserve that mic anymore. Babel is one of the best books ever written. Go read it. It's unbelievably amazing. It offers really valuable life lessons and really amazing commentary on anti-colonialism. Don't listen to this schmuck. He doesn't know what he's talking about. There you
Where
go.
did you learn the word schmuck from?
I should have brought my
Can
book.
I
over.
respond
How dare you use
can I
Babel?
respond to you both?
My Babel has done nothing wrong.
Okay, I'm gonna respond to you, but I want to lay some ground rules. Okay, so obviously this question is for someone who likes reading books, I would assume. They enjoy reading books, and they're just worried about should I read nonfiction or fiction. Okay, so that being said, they already like reading books, right? If we're going to the argument about what's productive using time, well, why read a book? Why not go to the gym? Why not do something else that's more productive? You can build a list of what's more productive than even reading this nonfiction book, right? Why not read a white paper, research paper? Why not read an equation? You know what I'm saying? Right. It's endless. I think when someone's reading fiction, the fact that it's for entertainment, right? That's a big value. You don't necessarily have to make your whole life about being productive and efficient, right? Just sometimes relaxing is so beneficial to your mental health and your body that's more productive, right? If you're straining yourself 24/7, working really hard, you are killing yourself in a way. You're not enjoying life. I think, yeah, entertainment is a big value, and that might be one of the most productive things you can do sometimes. So I don't see this argument about wasting time being a fact. You know what I mean?
You make some good points. So let me clarify. When I say like being productive, I'm talking about in the case where I want to read something. Like I sit down and I want to read something, and I'll choose something that's more productive, I guess, in the sense that you gain more knowledge about the world directly. You know, whether that's something about society or physics, etc., or your own mind or self-help things. It doesn't mean I'm excluding other productive things, right? And I also do that because I find it entertaining, right? I enjoy, like, for me, it's relaxing to read about, you know, some human history or something.
So you are saying it's not about it's like, if I'm going to read, I'd rather not just read for entertainment. I should always, like, read for information that's beneficial to me that I also find entertaining. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But I think fiction also can provide that, as Prosan mentioned. There's real things that are interweaved into these stories. I think for fiction, of course, some people have preference, right? We're asking, is fiction worth even reading? Mm-hmm. I think for certain audiences, certain age groups, it's easier for them to engage with fiction and the author to put these messages and beneficial information within these stories, right? It's like marketing, you know, you give them something to lure them in and slowly give them messages that's beneficial to them, right? So it's possible, right? I don't think you can't just say, yo, you shouldn't read fiction, you should always read nonfiction.
I agree with you. Like, there is value to fiction, and I agree with you. That's the original point I took. It's more, I guess, up to personal preference, right? Like for me, like I find nonfiction entertaining enough where I usually choose that over fiction. But I also enjoyed Babel. Like I really enjoyed it. Yeah, but I'm just not as crazy about fiction, right? That's all. Yeah.
So I just want to say that, like, although nonfiction books can often be a little like bland and very objective, there are nonfiction books like Zayd talked about that are also like based on true real life stories that are also entertaining because they're written in kind of like a narrative form. When you choose a nonfiction book that is entertaining, one of the reasons that it's kind of better than a fantasy book is you can be sure that it's like something that's really happened, right? It's real. The things that are written in a fantasy book, whatever life lessons or whatever entertainment value that they're giving you is based on a fantasy world, right? Like how can you be sure what you're learning is actually like useful or true? It's based on a fantasy world where the author can talk about anything or anything happens. Is it a real depiction of real life? Not really, right? Whereas a nonfiction book, you can be sure whatever life lesson that you're learning really did happen in this reality, real life world. You know what I mean?
Let's do final words from everyone, and then I'll go last because I want to.
I'm gonna use my final words to respond to that. Stories that are based on reality, productive and meaningful, I guess. I remember reading the book, something about the fire. It's like kids that are lost in an island. It's a very classic book. King of the Flies, something like that.
Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies. That book, it's just a fictional story about these boys, but it delivers such great messages, how society works. For me at an early age, it gave me insight into how the world kind of operates without getting to see that darkness in real human beings, right? So I get to capture that. And there's other books that show how society can behave at the extremes. Forget the names. There's a book about what's that catch-22 type of thing? Okay, something like that. There's stories where authors pushing these type of ideas where free speech becomes stopped and everybody's controlled by robots. They're doing that to show a possibility in the future, right? So you can't do that with nonfiction stories because they haven't happened yet. You're gonna wait to write about it when free speech is done. You're gonna write about it? No, you want to put this message out there. That's all.
Okay, my closing arguments is this. So the the question was, does fiction offer something more than nonfiction? And I think the movie equivalent of this is movies that are not documentaries offer something more than documentaries. Sure. Right? And it's obvious it does, at least in movies, right? And I think it's equivalent in
so you're
fiction.
flipping again?
No, let me make my point. Let me finish my point. So it's obvious it does. Like, obviously, fiction offers a way to expand your awareness of different perspectives, look into worlds that don't exist, right? And maybe have some philosophical or moral lessons that come out of it. But I don't think that means you should force yourself to read fiction or watch movies that are not documentaries. If you like watching documentaries only or reading nonfiction, I mean, that's fine too. Yeah, that's my point.
Well, yeah, one final point that I'd like to make maybe to your statement is even in the case of like The Lord of the Flies, it's kind of trying to, it's a book where you're kind of basing it on nonfiction elements, right? A lot of the fantasy books really go outside the realms of reality, right? So what do you do in those scenarios? Like where it's a book about, fire breathing dragons that fall in love or something, that's totally fine, but can you extrapolate the same sense of applicability to real life as you can to a nonfiction book?
I think so, but I'll wait to respond. All right, I get to go last because I wanted to. I was playing devil's advocate all along, but I think there's a lot of value in specifically reading fiction. The logic I'm going to use will apply in part to movies and TV shows too, but I'm going to talk specifically about books. I'm holding this book for a reason. It's The Sword of Kaigen by Emil Wong. It doesn't involve fire-breathing dragons, but it involves people who can basically bend water, kind of like Avatar: The Last Airbender, or air, or fire. And one of the premises of these books is that there's these specific warriors in this nation that can bend water, that can create swords of ice, that can even cut through the best steel. That's the premise of the book. That's one of the premises of the book. But the reason I'm holding it because I think this book offered me something in terms of the characters and their psychologies and their relationships that I don't think I would have even gotten from a nonfiction book on psychology. Like, it really dove deep into the relationship between this father, their son, and the father's wife, the boy's mother, and explored that relationship in a way that I never think I would have read or enjoyed or understood as well from a nonfiction book. And also woven into that was the fact that the mother had never wanted to be a family woman. She had never wanted to be a mother. She had wanted to be a soldier, and she had to give all that up because of familial expectations. The father being emotionally stunted was also woven into that, which is a big problem in our culture especially. And then also woven into that was the fact that the son had faced a lot of expectations to become exactly like his father when he grew up. And the way the book gets to dive deep into each of those characters' mindsets, because each of them are viewpoint characters, or at least two of those three are viewpoint characters. You can't get that in nonfiction unless it's an autobiography. Then you can, but I don't think there's that many autobiographies that are that good out there. And even in an autobiography, the only person whose mindset you'll get to explore that deeply will be the author. So you don't get that in nonfiction. You don't really get it in movies or TV show unless there's an overarching narrator, which can usually just get annoying and tropey and still won't be as in depth. So I think that's something in fictional books that you get that you will not get anywhere else. And it's one of the reasons why I read this much fiction. I probably read more fiction than I've watched TV shows and watched movies. So I'll end on that. I think there's a lot of value in reading fiction. And at the end of the day, this is just a conversation for fun. Nobody get mad at us. Nobody's shitting on anyone. Nobody's shaming anyone for reading fiction. I read a lot of fiction. If you like reading fiction, that's a good enough reason to read it. And that's where we'll end it.